seem to be somewhat effective, although I can always get better. We can always get better, and there are a lot of new things that we need to try. But I was not always this person. At one time, I was a 6-year-old immigrant elementary school kid living in a completely white community that was completely white because there were actual rules that said Black people can't move in here, Latinos can't move in here. By the 70s, families like mine were sometimes allowed to move in there. But I was surrounded by white people, no other Indians, no Black people, no Latinos. And all I wanted was to be an American and to be accepted. And I took all my cues about how to do that from the TV. I watched 5 hours of it every day. I got home, it turned on. Nobody told me to turn it off until I went to bed because my parents were lax like that. But I like to think of myself as proof that you can stick the kids in front of the TV and walk away, they'll be fine. Although TV in the 70s was quite different from TV today, so maybe it's not so true. But I grew up really not trying to avoid the reality of my immigrant status, of my brown skin, of the way that people saw me. My friends would say, oh, we don't even think of you as Indian, we think you're just like us, which kind of meant like they didn't see all the Indian parts of me, which is pretty much all the parts of me. But I'd be happy when they said that. I would think, oh, that means that finally I fit, I belong. So then I got to college, and I was so allergic to any sense of myself as a person of color that when I went to college, my college had a pre-orientation program for students of color. I skipped it. I was like, that's not for me, not about me. I didn't go. But in my second year of college, there was a racial justice campaign that started on my campus that was led by the Black students. And there were rallies and meetings happening regularly. And I was hanging out with my friends Valerie and Yuko one night. Valerie is a biracial Black and white woman, and Yuko is a Japanese national who was raised in the States. And there was a rally the next day, and they wanted me to go, and they were like, let's go to the rally. And I said, I'm not going to that rally because I don't do rallies, and that race thing, that's not for me, that's not me. And my friends did an intervention on me and on my denial, like I was on drugs, because denial is a little like a drug, right? Give yourself a little, you can sort of forget the thing you were trying to deny, but it wears off and you have to have some more denial. So they wanted to bust through my denial, and they told me straight up, Rinku, you are not a minority, you're a person of color. And you're not a girl anymore, you're a woman now. It's not usually the context in which you hear that, but it worked. And basically they said, you've got to grow up and go to this rally. So sometimes, occasionally, when your friends talk to you like that, but with love, you do the thing. So I went to the rally. It was, 20 people, straggly signs. We had much less good chants at rallies in the 80s than we do today. Hip hop has really helped our chants, our protest chants, as well as everything else. See, multicultural is always better. And so it was a little bit straggly, and it wasn't like the most awesome rally you could ever attend. It was early days in the campaign. And yet, at that rally, for the very first time in the 12 years since my family had immigrated, I felt like I belonged. I did belong. Those were my people, I realized. And it was when I realized that being an American is not about looking like Marsha Brady. Do you know who Marsha Brady is? Yes. It's not about looking like Marsha Brady. I should probably update that reference, but she was mine. She was my American, while I was growing up and watching all this TV. So it's not about looking like Marsha Brady, it's about making an investment in the place you're in. You're in an American community, and it becomes an American community when you do your best to make it the most inclusive, compassionate, and effective community that it can be. And that's always going to happen when we're more together than when we're divided from each other. So I understood at that moment, if I want to be an American, my job is to help bring us together, to be civically active, and to be all the way in whichever community I find myself, so that it can be a better community. The way we get there is by loving our people and also loving all the questions. The great Grace Lee Boggs, who was an organizer and scholar and activist, Grace Lee Boggs, in one of her memoirs, she put in a cool 100 years on this earth. And I swear she spent every minute of it, including the time she was sleeping, making change and mentoring young people into political action. So she wrote this in an essay called I Must Love the Questions Themselves. She wrote, even when people in our communities or of our country act in ways that we find unworthy of human beings, even when they act in ways we find unworthy of human beings, we must still care for them enough that their lives and ours, their questions and ours, become inseparable. We must still care for them enough that their lives and ours become inseparable. To me, that really means that that includes even people who don't agree with me. I talk to lots of folks who say, well, you're okay because you're a legal immigrant, but I don't like those other immigrants. And I can understand why they would say that with the information that they have available to them. My job is to get them to a place where they want more information, where they get some of the real information and where they want more information. And you can only do that by loving them. If they think you hate them, they don't want to talk to you anymore, as I'm sure you've all experienced, right? So you have to love the people, but you also have to love the questions themselves. Jim started out talking about how today is the 50th anniversary of that March on Washington, and this is your 50th anniversary as a college. This college has changed many times in those 50 years because any institution, any human individual that tries to stay the same finds that it can't, pushes against the changes that are always coming. And migration is always going to be a part of us because it's part of human life. It's part of how human beings are human, that we migrate. So each time we fix something in our institution or in our community, we're going to generate new questions. We're going to generate contradictions. Every solution creates new problems, but that's what you want. You don't want just the same old problems decade after decade, century after century. Let's create some new problems by moving some new solutions. And let's love the questions themselves. Love and questions, that's how we make for a future America. Thank you so much.
We have time for a few questions from the audience.
One thing you touched on a couple times was that a lot of large corporations and private industries, they tend to exploit these problems that we have and cause friction that slow down the process of fixing these problems. And I was just wondering what your opinion was on that, and what can we do to kind of fix that?
Yeah, so the question was, in case everyone couldn't hear it, that I talked about the ways that large corporations and businesses exploit divisions and problems. And I mean, the private prison industry is a really good example, right? Because they make money when people are afraid. So if I'm afraid of immigrants who, Jan Brewer, the governor of Arizona, she's important, she's big, right? She can't be lying about people crossing the border and beheading folks. If I'm afraid of that, then I'm going to want that new immigration jail in my community. Also, I might get a job in that immigration jail, and if I'm jobless, then any job is better than no job at all. So I think that to me, what it really means is we have to pay attention to what business is doing. Raise your hand if you read the business pages in your newspaper. Yeah, there's like 3 hands up here. That's not going to work. I think often we think of business and money and how money gets made as natural, like capitalism is natural, and we've always had this where, people sell our labor to a boss, and the boss decides how much he's going to pay for our labor, and we pay for goods and services, but in fact, we haven't always had this. Capitalism isn't always the way that things have been done. And in parts of the world, it's still not the way things are done. They're done largely through barter or other kinds of economic arrangements. So read the business pages and educate yourself about what companies are doing. That is number one. Number two, you can get involved in all sorts of corporate accountability campaigns. There are great organizations. Grassroots International does great work globally on controlling corporate behavior. Some of the environmental organizations do great work, like Rainforest Action Network, and as I said, climate disaster drives migration, and much climate disaster is feeding corporate profit, or environmental degradation is feeding corporate profit. There's also Detention Watch Network on the immigration front, does a lot of work against private prisons, as well as an organization called Grassroots Leadership. So those are some of the ways you can get involved in corporate campaigns, and I think the divestment campaigns are really good ones.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Yeah, go ahead.
This is just like correlating to what you were talking about, the racial lens, and how it can benefit everyone when you view things through racial lens and try to fix things for a small group of people. It's kind of like the curb corner.
The curb cut, right?
Yeah, the curb cut, where it was originally intended for people with wheelchairs, but it helps people who have strollers, who have bikes, who have so many people.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. That's called the curb cut effect. So did everybody hear that? Curbs were cut for wheelchairs, but help so many other people. A good racial example of a similar example is in Seattle, the city attorney of Seattle, Washington, he noticed that, so there's a thing that happens in immigration policy where things that are not felonies in regular law become felonies for immigrants. Does that make sense? So it might be a misdemeanor in civil, native law, but for immigrants, it becomes a deportable offense. So Pete Holmes is still the city attorney of Seattle, and one of the things he understood is that if we have an immigrant and we get a conviction, then if the sentence is 365 days or longer, that immigrant, even if they're a green card holder and have papers, that immigrant becomes eligible for criminal deportation. You do your time and then you get deported, which I think is double jeopardy, right? Like, either deport me or let me do my time, but don't make me do both, because that's double punishment for one thing. So Pete Holmes told all his prosecutors, when you have a low-level crime, then go for a sentence of 364 days or less, because I don't want to have criminal deportation kick in for low-level crimes. That's just not right. So who does that help? Who do you think is helped by that instruction on low-level prosecutions go for 364 or less? Everybody who does anything low level, but especially people who can't afford a good lawyer. Because any good lawyer going in is going to say, even if there's a conviction, this is a low level crime, and they're going to negotiate for a smaller sentence, right? So you could be a poor white person in Seattle, you don't have money for a good lawyer, you may end up getting 365 or more, but you're not going to, because Pete Holmes made this change in the Attorney General's practice. So this makes sense. I could go on. I could give you dozens of examples of things that were created, often demanded by people of color because they needed it. That also helps all sorts of other struggling people as well. Thank you. One more, maybe? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. You've inspired and discouraged me.
That's what I aim for every time.
You did, yeah. So you told the story about naphtha and sugar, the farmer, and I had a business, and I never, whenever I hired immigrants, I'd always look at their papers to make sure that they were quote legal. But a lot just suggesting that story about how we create our own problem here needs to be.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really important point to make. And so much of that creation has been driven by profit, by the desire for profit. Immigrant workers are generally going to be cheaper than native workers. And sometimes that's a whole very complicated set of things to figure out. But one point I'll make to add to yours is that not one employer has ever gone to jail for hiring an undocumented worker. Not one, ever. Not in the entire history of this country. But who goes to jail? The workers themselves. So where you're placing the responsibility and the blame, and when it's the workers themselves, all that does is make them so vulnerable to labor exploitation. I know so many workplaces where the immigrant workers started organizing, and the employer just called ICE. So all you have to do, just call ICE, get your workers raided, the troublemakers get deported, jailed and deported, and you carry on. You hire just as many undocumented workers by not knowing, by not looking, as you did before. You pay them, you create substandard labor conditions for them, but you will never have to worry about going to jail, even if those things are in fact illegal to do. Yeah, thank you. And I'm not arguing that they should go to jail necessarily. I'm arguing that the whole system creates these opportunities to exploit people without any responsibility. Okay, I think we're good. Thank you so much, all of you, and carry on.
Thank you very much, and I just want to remind you, College Center 220, right about now, we are offering lunch, so please join us there. Thank you.